The morning sun spilled across Arlington National Cemetery, casting long shadows from the endless rows of white headstones. Each marker stood in perfect formation, stretching toward the horizon, silent witnesses to lives once lived with courage, duty, and sacrifice. The air carried a stillness that seemed to press down on every visitor, demanding reverence with every step. The faint sound of distant bugles and the rustle of flags in the breeze gave the ground an unshakable weight, a reminder that here, silence was sacred. She stepped off the shuttle bus just beyond the main gates, clutching a folded photograph in her hand. To anyone passing by, she looked like an ordinary woman, modest clothing, a jacket zipped against the cool September wind, hair tied back without effort. No uniform decorated her figure, no medals gleamed against her chest. She did not move like a soldier accustomed to ceremony, nor did she stand like someone expecting recognition. She walked with measured steps, calm yet deliberate, her posture marked by quiet strength. She blended into the visitors, appearing as another mourner among many. But inside her, the day carried far greater meaning. She had rehearsed this moment. For weeks, she told herself she would come, walk the grounds, stand quietly at the funeral of a man she had never met in person, and leave unnoticed. No one needed to know why she was there. To the rest of the world, she was nobody, just another face in the crowd. But in her heart, she carried a connection stronger than blood. The photograph in her hand was old, worn at the edges, bent from years of being carried in places where paper shouldn't last. It was not a picture of her family, or even of herself. It was an aerial image, grainy, marked with hand-drawn circles and coordinates. To anyone else, it would mean nothing. To her, it represented one of the countless intelligence reports she had once prepared, the lifeline she had handed to men who depended on details they never knew came from her. That report had guided the SEAL whose name was now etched on the funeral program. She had helped send him into battle. He had not come home. The crowd around her thickened as she moved deeper into the cemetery grounds. Families gathered in clusters, some carrying flowers, others walking in silence with folded flags clutched tightly to their chests. Military personnel stood tall, their uniforms pressed, shoes gleaming, ribbons proudly displayed in rows that told stories of service and sacrifice. The weight of their presence pressed against her, reminding her of what she lacked. She had no rank, no title, no outward proof of what she had given. If anyone looked at her, they would see only a civilian, but her eyes told another story. They carried years of exhaustion from sleepless nights bent over classified documents, decoding transmissions, analyzing scraps of intelligence that could mean life or death. They carried grief from names she remembered too well, men who had gone on missions with her guidance and never returned. They carried secrets, locked away in vaults of memory, forbidden by oath to ever be spoken aloud. Those eyes, more than any medal, bore the truth of her service. She paused by a row of headstones, each one gleaming in the morning light, identical yet unique in the sorrow they marked. She let her hand brush lightly across one, not to claim it, but to remind herself why she was here. These markers were not just symbols. They were people she had once known through names on screens, through intercepted messages, through reports that carried warnings not always heeded in time. Each stone carried the echo of choices she had made in silence. The funeral she had come for was gathering not far ahead. She could see the slow movement of the honor guard preparing, their white gloves bright against their dark uniforms. The coffin, draped in the American flag, waited to be carried. The sight tightened her throat. She did not know this man in person, yet she had known him through missions, through coded names and numbers that once passed across her desk. He had been real to her long before today, even if he had never known she existed. As she walked closer, the crowd began to arrange itself into neat lines. Family members stood near the front, supported by Marines and sailors in dress uniforms. High-ranking officers clustered to the side, their solemn expressions hiding the weight of command. She did not move to join them. Instead, she stepped quietly to the far edge, away from the rows of seats, far enough back that no one would question her presence. She had no claim to stand near the family, no authority to take a seat reserved for those who had served openly. She was a shadow at the edge of the ceremony, where she believed she belonged. Yet, even from the back, she felt the weight of every detail. The rifles gleaming under the sun, the ceremonial precision of the honor guard, the slow, deliberate movements of men who had trained to carry grief with discipline. Each detail was sharp in her mind, a reminder that service was not only about action, but also about respect, ritual, and the unbroken chain of honor. She kept her gaze fixed on the coffin, her fingers tightening around the photograph. She whispered, words no one could hear, a promise carried only in her breath. I remember, I always will. It was not enough, she knew, but it was all she had. Around her, other visitors passed, some pausing briefly, others moving on to different ceremonies. To them, she was simply another mourner among many. They could not know the history she carried, the invisible ties that brought her here. She did not need them to know. What she did not realize, as she stood quietly at the edge, was that she was not as invisible as she believed. Among the rows of uniforms and ranks stood men who had once depended on information they never fully understood. One of them, ACL commander, with sharp eyes and years of leadership etched into his face, noticed her. He recognized something, perhaps the way she stood, or perhaps the photograph clutched in her hand. Perhaps, too, he carried memories of missions where unseen hands had guided him to survival. His gaze lingered on her for a moment, longer than chance would allow, but she did not see him yet. She remained still, letting the silence of Arlington settle around her. She thought of the years she had lived in shadows, the sacrifices unspoken, the recognition never sought. She believed that today would be no different. She would come, honor the fallen, and leave without anyone knowing her name. What she could not imagine was that this day would not allow her to remain unseen. The woman at the edge of the crowd had once lived in a world of shadows, where her name was rarely spoken aloud, and her work was never signed. She was not the kind of soldier who appeared in photographs or stood in front of flags during ceremonies. Her battlefield existed behind closed doors, beneath dim fluorescent lights, where the sound of keystrokes and the rustle of classified files replaced the roar of gunfire. She served where silence was the weapon, and information was the shield. Her journey into that world had begun quietly. No recruiter promised her glory. No drill instructor demanded she run until she collapsed. She had been drawn instead by something different, a sharp mind for patterns, an ear for the details others missed. At university, while her classmates focused on textbooks and debates, she had been captivated by the ways words and numbers could hide entire operations. A visiting officer once gave a lecture about intelligence work, and though most students left unimpressed, she walked away changed. She saw in that moment a path where her skills could protect lives. The training was rigorous, though not in the way most imagined. There were no obstacle courses or rifles slung across her shoulder. Instead, there were endless tests of patience and precision. She learned to sift through thousands of intercepted communications, to spot a code hidden in an ordinary phrase, to recognize when silence meant more than words. She studied geography until she could draw borders from memory, studied languages until foreign words became second nature, studied psychology until she understood not only what was said, but why it was said. Her world became one of quiet observation, where the difference between success and disaster rested in whether she noticed. A detail others overlooked. And she noticed. Always. Her first assignment was not glamorous. She sat in a cramped room with headphones pressing against her ears, transcribing fragments of conversations intercepted across continents. Hours would pass without significance, her pen scratching down ordinary chatter about food, weather, family. Yet she learned patience. She learned to wait for the single word, the single phrase that transformed meaningless noise into critical intelligence. When that moment came, she was ready. A conversation about trucks and fuel was not what it seemed. She caught the coded pattern, traced it back, and realized it described the movement of weapons through a region where American soldiers were operating. Her report moved up the chain, and days later, a mission was altered. The soldiers returned unharmed. She had no medal, no handshake, not even confirmation that her work mattered. But in her heart, she knew. Lives had been saved. As years passed, her role grew. She moved from transcription to analysis, from simply recording data to weaving it into stories of strategy and survival. She became the unseen architect behind missions, connecting dots across maps, tracing voices across borders. Her office was filled with maps marked by pins and strings, each one a web of danger and possibility. She rarely slept through the night. Instead, she dozed in short bursts, always ready to respond to the next urgent request. Her face was rarely known outside her building, but her words carried far. Commanders read her reports before deploying men into dangerous territory. Pilots studied her briefings before flying missions into hostile skies. She never stood beside them on the battlefield, yet her fingerprints guided their every move. Still, her service carried a loneliness that never left her. She could not tell her family the details of her work. To them, she was simply a government employee, quiet and diligent, nothing more. At holidays, when relatives asked about her job, she offered vague replies. "It's mostly paperwork," or "I work in communications." She smiled and deflected, because the truth was sealed behind layers of security she could never breach. The weight of her service remained hers alone. There were nights when the loneliness pressed hard against her chest. Nights when she heard of missions gone wrong, of names added to the long list of the fallen. She would sit in the dark, staring at her maps, wondering if she had missed something, if another detail might have made the difference. The burden was invisible, but relentless. Unlike soldiers who wore scars upon their skin, hers lived hidden in her mind, replaying in silence. Yet there were also nights of quiet triumph. She remembered one mission in particular, when her team intercepted a sudden flurry of messages. Piecing them together, she realized an ambush was being prepared against a convoy of Americans. Her report raced through the chain of command, faster than she had ever seen. The convoy altered course at the last moment, avoiding the trap entirely. Weeks later, a commander she had never met sent a simple note through her superior. "Whoever caught that, tell them my men thank them." It was unsigned, unceremonious, but it was enough. She folded that note into her pocket and carried it. For years, her path was hidden not only from the public, but often from the very men she protected. The SEALs who trusted her intelligence never knew her face. They knew only the call signs on the reports, the typed summaries, the coordinates. They followed into danger. To them, she was a ghost who whispered directions from afar. But to her, they were brothers she would never meet. Lives she swore to protect, though they would never know her name. It was one of those brothers, whose coffin she now stood to honor. He had led a mission she once helped guide. She remembered. The night clearly, the maps spread across her desk, the urgent voices crackling through secure lines. She had worked through the night, piecing together fragments that revealed an enemy movement. She had passed the information along, knowing the risk, praying it would be enough. A mission succeeded, but months later, another one did not. He had fallen, far from home, and now she stood at his funeral. Her path had always been hidden, but that did not make it less real. She knew that service was not measured by rank or medals, but by lives touched, even if unseen. She had no trident, no stripes, no recognition. Yet every SEAL who returned home, every family spared a folded flag, was a testament to her work. As she stood at the back of the funeral crowd, the truth of her hidden path pressed on her chest. No one here knew her story. To them, she was just another woman holding a photograph. And that was as it should be. Her life had never been about recognition. It had been about duty, carried out in silence. But she could not know, as the honor guard prepared to move, that silence would not last. Recognition, unlooked for and unexpected, was already moving toward her, carried in the eyes of a commander who had once trusted his men's lives to her unseen hand. The funeral crowd shifted as the honor guard prepared their final motions, but her gaze had already drifted inward. Standing there, surrounded by solemn faces and crisp uniforms, she felt the invisible weight pressing against her chest. It was a weight she had carried for years, an accumulation of memories, decisions, and unspoken truths that no one else could see. The others bore medals on their chests, the gleam of polished ribbons telling the stories of their service. Her chest was bare. She wore only a simple blouse beneath her jacket, no decoration to hint at sacrifice, no insignia to suggest valor. But within her heart, medals of a different kind rested, unseen and unacknowledged. Each one carried a name. Each one carried a failure she could not forget. She remembered the first time loss became personal. A mission had gone wrong overseas, despite the careful intelligence her team had compiled. A convoy of soldiers had been caught in an ambush. Some had returned, battered but alive. Others had not. She had read the after-action report in silence, her fingers trembling as her eyes locked on the names of the fallen. She had recognized them. Not their faces, those she had never seen, but their call signs, the identifiers that had once lit up her desk like constellations. She had tracked their movements for weeks, built maps around their operations, studied their vulnerabilities and strengths. In her world, they had become familiar. And now, in a single report, they were gone. No one blamed her. The mission had been dangerous from the start. The enemy had shifted faster than anyone could have anticipated. Her superiors told her she had done everything right. But she could not silence the voice inside her head that whispered otherwise. What if I had seen more? What if I had stayed longer at my desk? What if one more piece of data was waiting, buried in the static, and I missed it? The what-ifs never left her. They became ghosts that followed her into every briefing, every intercepted message. She began to see faces where there were none, imagine families behind every soldier's name. Each mission she worked on was no longer an assignment. It was a life she might save or lose. That knowledge made her sharper, more relentless, but it also made the burden heavier than any uniform could bear. At night, she carried those names with her. Lying in bed, she replayed missions like films stuck on repeat, pausing at the moment where everything had gone wrong. She searched for the clue she should have spotted, the fragment of intelligence that might have shifted the outcome. Her work demanded compartmentalization, yet she could never seal the boxes tight enough. Memories seeped through the cracks, filling her dreams with static-filled voices and maps marked by circles that led to death. Unlike soldiers who wore scars on their bodies, hers were invisible. No one could see the way her eyes lingered too. Long on news reports, scanning for details only she would notice. No one could hear the silence in her voice when someone asked about her day. Her family thought she was simply quiet, private, withdrawn. They could not understand, that she carried a battlefield inside her mind. The hardest moments were not in the office, but at funerals like this one. The rows of folded flags, the solemn salutes, the families clutching photographs, all of it pressed against the truth she could never admit aloud. She had been part of these stories. She had guided men into danger, armed only with information she prayed was enough. When they did not return, she carried the loss alone. The families grieved openly, surrounded by support, while she stood silently at the edges, mourning without recognition. She had tried, once, to share the burden. Late one night, sitting at her kitchen table with a glass of untouched wine, she confessed a fragment of her pain to a close friend. She didn't mention classified details, only the feeling, the weight of knowing her work affected life and death. Her friend listened politely, but did not understand. "You can't hold yourself responsible for everything," the friend said gently. "You're just doing your job." "Just doing my job?" The words echoed like an accusation. Her job was not a filing cabinet or a desk assignment. It was the difference between a soldier returning home and a mother receiving a folded flag. She could not expect her friend to understand, but the attempt left her more isolated than before. She never tried again. Instead, she learned to wear masks. At work, she was composed, professional, sharp. With her family, she was the dutiful daughter, the helpful sister, the friend who always remembered birthdays. She smiled at barbecues, laughed at office jokes, nodded politely when neighbors complained about trivial things. But inside, she lived with ghosts. Every smile was a layer of armor, every laugh a disguise to keep others from seeing the cracks beneath. Still, she never considered leaving. The burden was crushing, yes, but it was also her purpose. Each time she thought of quitting, she imagined the men and women who depended on her unseen work. She remembered the times when her reports had saved lives, the commanders who adjusted missions because of her warnings. She thought of the note she carried folded in her pocket, the unsigned thank you from a man whose team had survived because of her. Those moments gave her strength. They reminded her that the burden, though heavy, was not meaningless. And so, she carried on year after year, unseen but vital. Her identity became a paradox, invisible to the world yet central to its safety. She walked through life as if she were two people, the ordinary woman who blended into crowds and the shadowed guardian who shaped battles from afar. The two selves rarely touched, except in places like this cemetery, where the boundaries blurred. Standing among the mourners, she felt the weight of both selves pressing on her. The civilian who should not belong here, and the unseen soldier, who belonged more than anyone realized. Her chest tightened as the honor guard lifted the coffin, the flag bright against the gray sky. She could not stop her mind from tracing back through years of missions, through every name she had memorized, every loss she could not forget. Each one pressed against her heart like another invisible metal. And in that moment, she realized something that unsettled her. The men being honored today, the ones buried beneath the rows of headstones, had been granted peace. Their burdens, though heavy, had ended with their last breath. Hers continued. She bore the weight not only of her own memories, but of theirs as well. She carried them forward, unseen, unnamed, yet never forgotten. That was the burden of her service. And it was a burden she would carry for the rest of her life. What she did not yet know was that someone standing only a few steps away, had seen enough to recognize her struggle. Her ghosts were invisible to the crowd, but not to the man whose eyes lingered on her, remembering the unseen hand that had once guided him. The air grew heavier as the ceremony began. The stillness that had lingered over the cemetery deepened into something almost tangible, as if the earth itself understood the gravity of what was unfolding. The woman adjusted her position at the edge of the gathering, keeping her distance from the rows of seats neatly arranged beneath the open sky. She had chosen her place deliberately, far enough back that she would not draw attention, close enough that she could see the man she had come to honor. The family of the fallen sat at the front, their grief laid bare in the open. A mother, her shoulders trembling though her chin remained lifted. A father, rigid in posture, but whose hand shook as he held the folded program. A young woman, perhaps. A wife or a sister, clutching a handkerchief so tightly it seemed it might tear. Their pain filled the air like an unseen current, rushing over the crowd, demanding reverence. Behind them, rows of uniformed service members stood in silence. Navy whites gleamed like bone in the sunlight. Marine dress blues cut sharp against the green grass, Air Force blues and Army greens blending into a living wall of discipline. Medals glinted across their chests, each decoration catching the sun like a whisper of past battles. Their stillness was not emptiness, but discipline, a solemn respect forged from shared understanding of what it meant to lose one of their own. The coffin, draped in the American flag, rested at the center of it all. 13 stripes rippled gently in the breeze, stars shining like a constellation stitched across cloth. The honor guard stood at each corner, white-gloved hands steady, eyes fixed forward. Their movements had been rehearsed countless times, yet today they bore the weight of finality. Each step, each turn, carried the dignity of a nation's gratitude. The woman's breath caught as the coffin began its slow procession toward the burial site. The measured pace of the pallbearers echoed through the ground, boots striking in perfect rhythm. Each sound seemed amplified, as if the earth itself marked their cadence. She clutched the photograph in her hand tighter, pressing the paper against her palm until its edges cut into her skin. This was the moment she had both dreaded and longed for, the final farewell to a man she had known only through shadows and signals, yet whose death felt carved into her own life. She let her eyes linger on the flag, her mind replaying nights spent in her office, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead, the voices of men like him moving across secure channels. She remembered the mission that had tied her to him, the intelligence that had once passed through her desk and into his command. She had not known his face then, only his voice, clipped and professional, relayed through coded reports. But now, seeing his coffin carried with such reverence, the connection felt more tangible than ever. Around her, the ceremony unfolded with practiced precision. A chaplain stepped forward, his voice steady but heavy with solemnity. He spoke of sacrifice, of courage, of duty fulfilled to the highest measure. His words echoed across the cemetery, blending with the rustle of leaves in the breeze. The woman listened, though her mind wandered. She thought of the countless chaplains she had heard in recordings after missions gone wrong, their words so similar, their voices struggling to give meaning to the unbearable. She shifted slightly, aware of the crowd pressing in behind her. Visitors who had not known the fallen soldier directly had gathered out of respect, drawn by the gravity of the event. Some bowed their heads, others placed hands over their hearts. To them, this was an act of patriotism, a way to honor sacrifice in general. But for her, it was personal, sharper than any act of ceremony. She had been part of his story, even if no one else here would ever know. As the chaplain's words faded, the honor guard prepared for their next movement. Rifles gleamed as they were lifted in unison, the ceremonial volley about to begin. The woman's heart pounded in her chest. She had heard those volleys before, each one a reminder of the finality of death, each shot a punctuation mark on a life ended too soon. She braced herself as the command rang out. Fire! The crack of rifles shattered the silence, echoing across the cemetery like thunder. Birds scattered from nearby trees, startled into flight. The sound rolled through her chest, sharp and unrelenting. Each volley a reminder of the cost paid by men like him and the cost carried by people like her who had guided them into danger. She closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her, trying to steady her breath. When she opened them again, the bugler had stepped forward. The first notes of taps floated into the air, soft and mournful, carried by the breeze. The melody twisted around her heart, pulling tears she had fought to contain. She blinked rapidly, unwilling to draw attention, yet unable to stop the emotion rising within her. The music carried memories, every funeral she had quietly attended, every loss she had silently mourned. The song was not just for him, it was for all of them. At the front, the family wept openly. A Marine bent gently to hand the folded flag to the soldier's mother. His words were low, but carried clearly enough to reach the edge of the crowd. On behalf of a grateful nation. The woman bowed her head, the phrase striking deep. She had heard it countless times in reports, recordings, transcripts. But hearing it in person, spoken to the family of a man she had indirectly served beside, was almost unbearable. She wanted to step forward, to tell them she had known him in a way, to tell them that their son, their brother, their husband, had not been alone in his final months, that unseen hands had guided him, protected him as best they could. But she could not. Her oath bound her, silence her constant companion. Her role was not to be known, not to be seen. So she stayed at the back, clutching her photograph, whispering silent words of respect. Her presence was her confession, her way of saying, I was part of his story. What she did not realize, as the final notes of taps faded into silence, was that someone had noticed. The SEAL commander at the front of the formation, standing tall in his decorated uniform, had caught sight of her. He had seen her face once before, years ago, during a classified briefing where analysts presented intelligence that would later shape his mission. He remembered her, not her name, not her rank, but her eyes. Eyes that carried the weight of burdens no one else could see. Now, as the coffin was lowered into the ground, his gaze lingered on her again. Something in her posture, the way she held the photograph, the quiet reverence that surrounded her, it told him everything he needed to know. She did not wear a uniform, but she was one of them. And soon, in a moment no one expected, the world would see that truth revealed. The funeral moved forward with the practiced rhythm of military tradition. The flag had been folded, the volley of rifles completed, and the bugler's notes still lingered in the air, hanging like threads of grief. The coffin now rested in its final place, surrounded by loved ones, guarded by precision and honor. At the back of the gathering, she remained still, clutching the photograph so tightly that her knuckles had gone pale. She had promised herself she would stay unnoticed, another face in the crowd, a silent mourner who would slip away when the ceremony ended. That was always her role, support without recognition, presence without acknowledgement. But then it happened. As the final words of the chaplain faded into silence, the SEAL commander leading the formation stepped forward. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his uniform heavy with rows of ribbons that spoke of years of service. His movements were exact, measured, reflecting decades of discipline. He had carried himself throughout the ceremony with the unbreakable composure expected of someone in his position. Yet now, as he turned toward the family to give his final respect, something shifted. His eyes, sharp and searching, swept the crowd. For a moment, they lingered on the front rows where the family sat, broken in grief. Then they moved past them, scanning the edges, as though searching for something or someone that did not belong in the neat order of ceremony. And then he found her. She did not notice at first. Her head was bowed, her fingers tracing the worn edges of the photograph. But when she felt the weight of a gaze upon her, she looked up. Their eyes met across the distance, and in that single glance, time seemed to stop. He knew her, Not by name, not by title, but by recognition deeper than memory. He had seen her before in a briefing room years ago, when analysts had delivered intelligence that saved his men from walking into a trap. He remembered the quiet woman in the back, her voice calm, her details precise. He remembered thinking then that she carried more than she revealed. And he remembered the reports that followed, each one carrying a style he had come to trust. He had never known who she was beyond those glimpses, but he knew her work. He had trusted her with the lives of his men. Now, seeing her here, holding a photograph, standing alone at the edge of the crowd, he understood everything. She had not come as an outsider. She had come because she belonged, even if no one else knew it. Without hesitation, he did something. No one expected. He stopped. The precision of the ceremony, the unbroken rhythm of military tradition, faltered as he turned fully toward her. His posture shifted, sharp and deliberate, and then he raised his hand. His palm cut through the air. In a crisp salute, fingers tight, arm steady. It was not casual, not symbolic. It was absolute. The moment froze the crowd. Whispers rippled through the rows as heads turned. Why had the commander stopped? Who was he saluting? The soldiers closest to him stiffened, their discipline rattled by the break in formality. The family glanced up, confused by the sudden pause. At the back, she felt her heart seize. For a moment, she thought she had imagined it, that the commander's eyes had merely swept past her. But no, his gaze was locked on hers, unwavering, his salute held high and steady. He was saluting her. The weight of it struck her like a tidal wave. She had lived her life unseen, her sacrifices hidden behind layers of secrecy. She had never expected acknowledgement, never asked for it. Yet here, in front of uniforms, families, strangers, and the nation's most sacred ground, the highest ranking officer present had turned away from tradition to honor her. Her breath caught in her throat. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she fought to steady herself. She did not want to collapse beneath the gaze of so many. Her hand trembled, hovering near her side, unsure what to do. Years of anonymity screamed at her to remain still, to let the moment pass. But another voice, deeper and stronger, urged her to respond. Slowly, hesitantly, she raised her own hand. Her salute was not sharp like his. It wavered slightly, unpracticed, the gesture of someone who had never stood in formation. But it was steady enough. It carried not the polish of ceremony, but the raw weight of truth. She held it there, her eyes never leaving his, her chest rising and falling with the force of emotions she had buried for years. The silence deepened. Around them, the world seemed to blur. Soldiers forgot their discipline and stared openly. Families hushed their whispers, watching this exchange unfold. Even the wind seemed to pause, as though the cemetery itself was bearing witness. In that salute, more was said than words could ever hold. He was telling her, "I know you. I know what you did. I know the sacrifices you made, though no one else does. You are one of us." And she was answering, "Thank you. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for carrying the truth that I thought would die with me. Thank you for letting me belong, if only for this moment." Her arm finally lowered, her hand trembling as it returned to her side. His salute dropped as well, his face unreadable, his composure unbroken. But their eyes remained locked for a moment longer, carrying an understanding that no one else could touch. Then, as if nothing had happened, he turned back toward the family and resumed his place. The ceremony continued, the rhythm restored, but the spell had already been cast. Those who witnessed it would never forget. The image of a commander saluting an unknown woman at the back of a funeral would remain etched in their minds, a mystery they would ponder long after they left the grounds. She stood frozen, her heart still racing, her eyes wet with tears she no longer tried to hide. For the first time in years, the burden she carried felt lighter. Not gone, never gone, but shared, acknowledged. Someone had seen her. Someone had sighed without words that her sacrifices mattered. And that truth, carried in a single salute, would stay with her for the rest of her life. The ceremony moved on, but for her, time remained fractured by that single, unshakable moment. The commander's salute replayed again and again in her mind, each detail etched into her memory. The precision of his hand, the steadiness of his gaze, the certainty of the gesture. It was unlike anything she had ever experienced. For years she had lived in the shadows, her contributions sealed within classified files, her presence erased from history's pages. Now, in front of strangers and soldiers alike, someone had acknowledged her truth. As the chaplain concluded his prayer and the family began to rise, she remained rooted in place. The crowd shifted, murmurs rising as people prepared to leave. But she stayed still, clutching the photograph tighter, unwilling to disturb the fragile weight of the moment. Around her, voices blended into a low hum, respectful but subdued. Families embraced, officers offered quiet condolences, and service members prepared to march away. Yet none of it pierced the cocoon that seemed to surround her. The salute had been wordless, but it spoke louder than any commendation, louder than any medal ever could. It told her she had been seen. She thought back to all the years she had worked in silence. The windowless offices, the endless screens filled with maps, signals and intercepts. The hours spent sifting through fragments of intelligence, piecing together patterns that might save lives. She had never held a weapon, never stood in combat boots, yet her fingerprints were on missions that changed the tide of battles. Still, when the stories were told, her part was invisible. Heroes were named, medals were pinned, speeches were given. And she had gone home alone, her role locked behind security clearances and silence. But today, in a cemetery filled with uniforms and families, one man had broken through that wall. The SEAL commander had looked at her, saluted her, and in that instant had lifted her out of anonymity. It wasn't a medal. It wasn't her name etched on a stone, but it was something greater. It was recognition, stripped of ceremony, pure and undeniable. Her chest tightened as she realized how much she had longed for it. She had told herself she didn't need acknowledgement, that anonymity was her shield, her duty. Yet the tears streaming down her face betrayed her. She had needed it more than she had ever admitted. And now, having received it, she felt both unmoored and healed. The commander returned to his unit, the formality of the ceremony closing. Around him again, but she caught glimpses of him as the crowd dispersed. He did not look her way again, not openly. That single exchange had been enough. Anything more would have drawn questions, broken the sanctity of the unspoken. And perhaps that was the truest form of respect. Recognition without explanation, acknowledgement without exposure. As the crowd thinned, she considered leaving. Slipping away quietly had been her plan from the start. Yet her legs resisted, holding her in place as she watched the family rise and walk toward the grave. The mother leaned heavily on a younger son's arm, her grief palpable. The folded flag rested in her lap, a symbol of pride wrapped tightly around her sorrow. The father walked stiffly, his steps deliberate, carrying himself like a man, determined not to break in front of others. The sight tore at her. She wanted to tell them she had been there too, in her own way, watching over their son when no one else could. But the oath of secrecy was ironclad. If she spoke, she risked not only her life, but the integrity of every mission she had ever touched. Silence was her service, and silence would remain her burden. Instead, she whispered under her breath, words carried only by the breeze. He was not alone. He mattered. You mattered. The tears blurred her vision, but she did not wipe them away. For once, she allowed herself the release, unhidden, unashamed. Around her, others wept too, and for the first time she felt she belonged among them. The salute had bridged the divide between her secret world and theirs. It had told her she was part of the same story, even if her name would never appear on the pages. It gave her permission to mourn openly, to grieve, not only for this soldier, but for all those she had lost in silence. As she stood there, a small memory surfaced, unbidden. Years ago, after a particularly grueling mission had ended with lives saved, one of her superiors had pulled her aside. He hadn't praised her. He hadn't even smiled. All he had said was, "Good work. No one will ever know." She had nodded then, accepting the truth of her profession. But the words had haunted her ever since. Now, with the commander's salute still echoing in her chest, she realized something new. Even if no one else ever knew, someone did. And that was enough. The cemetery slowly emptied. Cars rolled away, engines humming softly against the hush of the grounds. Soldiers departed in neat formations, their boots striking in unison until the sound faded. Families lingered, placing flowers, whispering prayers, holding each other. She remained among the last, unwilling to let go just yet. When at last she turned to leave, the commander was still there. He stood some distance away, speaking quietly with another officer. Their conversation was brief, but before he departed, he glanced once more in her direction. Not a long look, not something others would notice, just a fleeting acknowledgement. And though his face remained impassive, his eyes carried the same message they had before. She inclined her head slightly, a gesture of thanks, subtle and small. It was all she could offer. As she walked toward her car, the weight on her shoulders felt different. Lighter, yes, but also steadier. The years of silence, the loneliness of her work, had not been erased. But now they were balanced by something else. The knowledge that even in the hidden corners of service, her sacrifices had not gone unseen. Recognition without words had given her a gift she hadn't known how to ask for: validation, connection, belonging. And it had come not in grand speeches or medals, but in the quiet strength of a salute held between two people who understood. That night, long after the sun had set and the cemetery had fallen into stillness, she sat alone in her small apartment. The photograph lay on the table before her, the edges worn from years of being held. She traced the face in the picture gently, whispering again to the man she had come to honor. They know. At least one of them knows. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself a faint smile. The world might never speak her name. History might never record her role. But the truth no longer felt like a burden she carried. Alone, someone else bore a piece of it now, carried silently alongside her. And that was enough to steady her for the days ahead. The days after the funeral unfolded in quiet waves. The world seemed unchanged to everyone else. Traffic still hummed on the highways. Neighbors still walked their dogs. The rhythm of ordinary life rolled on without pause. But for her, everything had shifted. That single salute lingered in her mind like an echo, altering how she saw herself and her years of hidden service. She returned to her small apartment, the walls lined with no photographs except the one she had carried to the cemetery. Her life had been deliberately kept sparse, attachments trimmed away for the sake of secrecy. She had never married, never allowed herself the luxury of explaining why she stayed late, why she disappeared for weeks at a time, why her eyes carried the weight of grief that was not her own. Silence had built her existence, a fortress and a prison all at once. Now, in the stillness of her living room, the memory of the SEAL commander's salute replayed again. She closed her eyes, and saw the steadiness of his arm, the discipline of his stance, the absolute certainty in his gaze. It had been more than respect, it had been recognition. He had seen her, not just as a shadow behind the curtain, but as someone who mattered. And in that acknowledgement, she found a strange new strength. For years, she had carried a secret bitterness she never named. A small resentment that while others received medals, she received silence. Her pride had always been undercut by invisibility. Yet now, the bitterness seemed to ease, replaced by a deeper understanding. Perhaps true service was not about recognition from the many, but acknowledgement from the few who truly understood. She began to notice the way she walked into work the following week. Her colleagues, most of them analysts like herself, shuffled in with weary eyes, burdened by the monotony of their hidden tasks. They worked in cubicles under the same humming lights, parsing data, connecting threads of intelligence, shaping missions they would never see unfold. She had always felt anonymous among them, just another silent figure hunched over a keyboard. But now she carried herself differently. She held her head a little higher, moved with a steadier step. It wasn't arrogance, it was something quieter, a kind of acceptance. She no longer measured her worth against the absence of applause. She measured it against the truth she carried, that even in silence, she was part of something far larger than herself. The salute had given her permission to believe that silence could be a legacy in its own right. One evening, as she worked late, she found herself staring at an unfinished report. The details were precise, her conclusions clear, but her thoughts drifted. She remembered the soldier whose funeral she had attended, the one whose coffin bore the weight of her work. She thought of the countless others like him, soldiers whose fates had crossed her desk, whose lives had brushed against hers without ever knowing her name. She realized that every report she wrote, every pattern she uncovered, carried a piece of her. It was her way of being present without being seen. And though her name would never appear in the official accounts, her fingerprints would always remain. That was her legacy. Still, the loneliness pressed in. Late at night, in the quiet of her apartment, she sometimes spoke aloud, as though addressing the ghosts of those she had lost. "I was there," she would whisper. "I watched. Over you, I tried." The words gave her comfort, though they vanished into empty air. The commander's face returned often to her mind. She wondered if he remembered her as vividly as she remembered him. Perhaps he had already moved on, folding the salute into the discipline of his days, carrying it as just another silent gesture of respect. But for her, it had been transformative. She carried it like a talisman, proof that silence did not mean erasure. Weeks passed. Missions came and went. Reports flowed in endless streams, and the cycle of work continued. But inside her, something grew, a desire not to break her oath, but to leave behind some mark, however small, that would outlast her. Not for recognition, but as a quiet assurance that her silence had meaning. One night she opened a leather-bound journal she had never used. Its pages were blank, untouched for years. She hesitated at first, pen hovering, uncertain if writing her thoughts would betray her vow of secrecy. But then she began. She did not write names or dates or operations. Those would remain forever classified. Instead, she wrote feelings. She wrote about the weight of unseen service, the burden of carrying knowledge without voice, the ache of mourning in solitude. She wrote about the salute, about how it had changed her. Each page filled slowly, words flowing like a release she hadn't known she needed. The journal became her confession, her history carved in ink, invisible to the world but undeniable to her. If someday someone found it, they would not know the missions, but they would know the heart of the woman who lived within silence. Her legacy would not be medals or speeches, but truth recorded in quiet words. Months later, another funeral came. Different name, different family, different folded flag. She went again, slipping into the crowd as always, carrying her photograph as her token of presence. She wept with them silently, her tears blending into the grief of strangers. This time, she looked for him, the commander. He was not there. But she carried him with her anyway, his salute still alive in her memory. Standing at the back, she realized something profound. She was not saluting only him that day. She was saluting herself. The silent version of her who had carried burdens unseen. The part of her that had endured without applause. The woman who had served faithfully, not for recognition, but because it mattered. As the bugler played taps once more, she felt the weight of her oath settle more comfortably on her shoulders. Silence was no longer her prison. It was her choice, her gift, her legacy. And when the rifles cracked through the air, she did not flinch. She stood tall, whispering under her breath the words she now believed. I was seen. Even once is enough. Later, back at her desk, her colleagues noticed a difference in her. She was the same quiet analyst, the same steady worker, but there was a calmness about her, a quiet strength. They could not name it, but they felt it. She carried herself like someone who knew a truth that no one could take from her. A legacy of silence had always been hers. But now it was no longer emptiness, it was fullness, defined not by the absence of recognition, but by the presence of meaning. She would never tell the story. She would never break her vow. But the memory of a single salute had changed how she bore it. Silence had become her inheritance, her offering, her honor. And as she turned another page in her journal, writing not for the world, but for herself, she smiled softly. Her story did not need to be shouted from podiums or etched in stone. It was written in her heart, in her tears, in her silence. It was written in the legacy of one unseen woman, saluted once, remembered forever. The years moved quietly, almost imperceptibly, but for her, time carried a new weight. She continued her work in the shadows, guiding missions with the same meticulous care as always. Maps, reports, and intercepted communications still filled her office, but now each page held not just the burden of responsibility, but the affirmation that someone had seen her worth. The memory of that single salute remained a touchstone, a quiet assurance that her work mattered, even when the world remained oblivious. She had grown accustomed to the rhythm of her life, a careful balance between anonymity and purpose. Her apartment remained sparsely furnished, her walls bare except for the photograph she had carried to the cemetery, the one that had been her anchor through years of hidden service. On her desk, alongside the journal she had begun writing after. That day, the photograph sat framed, a symbol of all she had endured and all she had silently preserved. Occasionally, she would find herself thinking of the SEAL commander. She wondered how many times he had recalled that moment, how often he remembered the quiet woman at the edge of the crowd. Perhaps he had already moved on, folding her presence into his discipline and daily duties. But for her, the memory was eternal. The salute had given her a voice without words, acknowledgement without ceremony, and a place in a history that would never speak her name aloud. Her colleagues continued their routines as well, many unaware of the quiet influence she wielded. They saw a competent, reliable analyst, someone who could extract clarity from chaos, but none understood the depth of her service. She did not correct them, nor did she need to. Her satisfaction came from the knowledge that lives were saved, that missions succeeded, that the soldiers she never met returned safely because of her work. Recognition from strangers was irrelevant. The validation she sought had been granted by the one who understood, and that had always been enough. One spring morning, as cherry blossoms drifted along the city streets outside her office window, she received an unexpected message. It was an official communication, routed carefully through secure channels, requesting her presence at a private briefing. She paused, a sense of cautious curiosity settling over her. These briefings were routine for her, yet this one felt different. Perhaps it was nothing more than intuition, or perhaps it was the ripple of destiny finally making itself felt. She arrived at the secure facility, her movements calm but precise. The doors closed behind her with a muted thud, sealing her once again in the world of confidentiality she had navigated for years. At the briefing room, the familiar faces of senior officers greeted her, nods exchanged in professional courtesy. And then, standing quietly at the front, was the SEAL commander. He had aged in the years since that cemetery, lines etched into his face by responsibility and experience, yet his presence remained commanding, unyielding, unmistakable. For a fleeting moment, the air between them seemed to still. Neither spoke, but their eyes met, and a silent acknowledgement passed an unbroken chain, connecting the moment of the salute to the here and now. He gestured toward a seat beside him, a subtle invitation she accepted without hesitation. A briefing began, routine in its surface content, but with undertones she could detect, missions shaped with precision, analyses reviewed with care. As she contributed her insights, she noticed the commander observing her intently, not as a superior assessing performance, but as someone who recognized the depth of her skill, the weight of her dedication. There was no need for words. The understanding between them had transcended language long ago. After the briefing concluded, the room emptied, leaving only the two of them. He motioned toward the window, where sunlight spilled over the cityscape, and for a moment the formalities of rank and secrecy melted away. "You were there," he said quietly, his voice carrying more acknowledgement than any medal or commendation could. "I remember." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and for a heartbeat, she allowed herself the faintest smile. No explanation was required. No details were needed. He knew, and that was all that mattered. "I never expected recognition," she admitted softly, her voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head, a faint, knowing smile crossing his features. "It wasn't about expectation. It was about truth. And the truth is, you made a difference. More than anyone could see." The weight of his words settled into her chest, heavier than any medal she had ever imagined, lighter than the silence she had carried for decades. Recognition had come, not in the form of ceremony, but in the acknowledgement of someone who had lived in the same hidden trenches she had navigated alone. As they stood, she realized that the salute from years ago had never been a single moment. It had been a bridge to this moment. It had opened the path to understanding, to belonging, and to a quiet sense of fulfillment that had eluded her for most of her life. Days turned into weeks, and the memory of that interaction strengthened her resolve. She returned to her work with renewed vigor, the knowledge of acknowledgement energizing her dedication. Every mission she touched, every analysis she completed, carried a renewed sense of purpose. She understood that her contributions might never be recognized broadly, but they were enduring. Lives depended on her judgment, and that, more than public accolades, defined her legacy. She also began to write more deliberately in her journal, capturing her experiences and emotions in words that would remain hidden but true. Pages filled with reflections, the weight of silence transformed into clarity and meaning. She wrote not for the world, not for accolades, but for herself and for those whose lives she had touched in ways they would never know. One evening, long after the office had emptied and the hum of city life settled into night, she held the photograph once more. The man in the image, the soldier she had honored silently, seemed almost to look back at her. She traced the edges gently, whispering once again, "I remember you. I have never forgotten." The salute, the acknowledgement, the unspoken connection, it all converged in that small, private act of remembrance. She understood now that the true honor of service was not in public recognition, but in the enduring impact of one's actions. Unseen but consequential. Years later, as she walked through Arlington National Cemetery again, this time in a lighter wind and under a sky painted with late afternoon hues, she paused at another grave. The air carried the same solemn stillness she had known before, yet her step felt different, steady, assured, unburdened. She laid a small token of remembrance beside the headstone, a quiet gesture of respect for a life intertwined with hers through the invisible threads of service. In the distance, she imagined the SEAL commander observing from afar, a ghost of the past that had anchored her present. She knew he would recognize her, even in the anonymity of the crowd, and she smiled softly at the thought. Recognition without words had evolved into a living, breathing reality. As the sun dipped behind the horizon, she realized that her legacy was no longer confined to secrecy alone. It lived in the lives saved, the missions guided, the invisible threads connecting her to those she had served. It lived in the salute that had changed everything, in the quiet acknowledgement that had lifted decades of invisible burdens. And most importantly, it endured. The world would never know her name. History would not record her deeds. Yet, in the hearts of those who had been touched by her unseen hand soldiers, families, commanders, and even herself, her legacy would remain. Silent, steadfast, eternal, she walked away from the grave, feeling the weight of decades finally balanced by understanding and connection. The salute that had begun as a fleeting moment of recognition had become a beacon, guiding her through a life of hidden sacrifice. She carried it forward, not for acclaim, not for remembrance, but for the quiet truth it embodied. That service, when offered with unwavering dedication, is never truly unseen. And in that knowledge, she finally felt whole.